Many historians and political experts say the 80th anniversary of the United Nations Charter should be celebrated by the international community, despite pessimism over the challenges that it faces in today's world. In 1945, the UN's founding document was signed in San Francisco in the aftermath of World War II. Correspondent Mitch McCann reports from the United Nations.
As the long shadow of World War II loomed over the international community in 1945, nations worked to create an organisation to help prevent another conflict with such devastating consequences. And for 9 weeks in the spring of that year, delegates from 50 governments gathered to draft the organisation's founding document, the United Nations Charter.
It is now my duty, my honour and my privilege in the chair to call for a vote on the approval of the Charter of the United Nations.
One that still guides an organisation that has grown from 50 original signatories to 193 member states. Among its 19 chapters, the Charter says the purpose of the UN is to maintain international peace and security, to develop friendly relations among nations, and to achieve international cooperation.
I think just the sheer longevity of the Charter, keeping in mind that, the League of Nations and the relevant documents to that lasted only 20 years. 80 years is a very good track record. But also the fact that you actually now have more countries which have voluntarily signed up to the Charter and accepted that is another endorsement of the veracity, validity of the Charter.
UN analyst Daniel Forty says the founding members of the United Nations likely did not anticipate how it would evolve, expanding its membership so significantly and broadening its scope of work. And while many conflicts have occurred since its creation, he notes that there has not been a third world war, which after all was the very reason the UN was founded.
And in that sense, one could argue that it is very successful. You have the great powers around the room dealing with matters of war and peace. But, and at the same time, it's fostered a degree of international cooperation, not only on international peace and security, but on development and human rights that in many ways far exceeded what the founders of the UN imagined 8 decades ago.
The United Nations, though, faces challenges in solving the crises of today, including conflicts and wars in Ukraine, Sudan, Gaza, and recent hostilities in Iran. Some experts say that the Security Council's permanent members need to take greater responsibility for living up to the Charter's goals and intentions. Daniel Forty adds that most diplomats would agree reform of the Security Council is needed. While the UN faces many obstacles, Secretary-General Antonio Guterres said that the UN is a living miracle, forging peace, tackling poverty, hunger and disease. And in a time of financial difficulties and geopolitical instability, the international community may need to rely on the UN founding document more than ever. Mitch McCann, CGTN, at the United Nations in New York.
To talk about China's role in creating the United Nations and the country's efforts for multilateralism, we welcome Victor Gao. He is chair professor at Soochow University and joins us from Beijing. Victor, good to see you. As I said...
Thank you very much for having me.
You're welcome, sir. As I said, the United Nations is celebrating the 80th anniversary of its founding. Now, China played a pivotal role in the establishment of the organization. What can you tell us about China's role in the founding of the UN?
Indeed, China actually was the first country to sign the United Nations Charter. And this is very significant because China demonstrated that it really earned its place at the United Nations as well as at the United Nations Security Council, becoming a permanent member state of the United Nations Security Council from the very beginning with a veto power. Why did China make such great achievement? This is a reflection of the what we call the 14-year-long Chinese people's anti-Japanese aggression war. Now, this is very significant because for the Americans, the war after Japanese surprise attack on Pearl Harbor lasted for less than 4 years, but China became occupied by the Japanese aggressors as early as in 1931, and the Japanese aggressors gradually expanded their aggression and occupation to other parts of China. But China refused to surrender, and after December 1941, China and the United States became allies, and we fought shoulder to shoulder together until we win the final victory of Japan by securing Japan's unconditional surrender. This means that China really made great achievements, and China sacrificed around 35 million people, including military casualties as well as people killed and slaughtered by the Japanese aggressors in the course of 14 years of Japanese aggression. Now, this is truly a very momentous moment for the Chinese people as well as for people in other countries, because the defeat of Japanese fascism in the Asian Pacific theater became such an important part of the overall success of mankind against Nazi Germany in the European theater, as well as Japanese fascism in the Asian Pacific theater. Combined together, these became the pillars upon which the international world order was established on the ashes of the Second World War.
Victor, over the decades, the United Nations has come under criticism, some of it very fierce at times. Some say it is outdated, that it needs to redefine its role as well as how it functions in the 21st century. But if we look at the world since the end of World War II, it has largely kept the peace. There have been conflicts for sure, but it has largely kept the peace. What is your assessment?
Well, first of all, lots of criticisms about the United Nations, about its inefficiency and lack of efficiency in getting many things done is actually well-founded. However, one thing which is more important than that is that all these failures by the United Nations over the decades seem to be related to one ultimate triumph or victory that the United Nations has actually achieved. That is to avoid the outbreak of another world war, especially a war between and among the 5 permanent member states of the United Nations Security Council. To that extent, I think the United Nations actually managed to achieve the ultimate goal of preserving peace, especially peace between and among the 5 permanent member states. So I think we need to be very objective and very philosophical in looking at the failures, which are indeed true and abundant, of the United Nations, but also the rare and distinct victory of the United Nations in maintaining peace and preventing a world war breaking out between and among its permanent member states of the Security Council.
Now, China is responsible for 20% of the UN budget. That's right behind the United States, which contributes 22% of the budget. And in a distant third place is Japan with 7%. But the United States right now is withdrawing from many of the organs of the United Nations, many of its agencies. Here is how the Chinese Foreign Ministry responded to the United States withdrawing from one of those agencies, UNESCO, which is the UN Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization. Let's listen.
This is already the 3rd time the U.S. has withdrawn from UNESCO, and it has long been in arrears of its membership fees. This is not the action a responsible major country should take. On the 80th anniversary of the founding of the United Nations, we call on all countries to reaffirm their commitment to multilateralism, take concrete actions to support the international system with the UN at its core, international rules based on international law, and the basic norms governing international relations based on the purposes and principles of the UN Charter.
Now, Victor, China is committed to multilateralism. And I mean, how important is that for China right now when we see countries like the United States cutting ties with the UN?
Allow me to make one point before I answer your very important question. That is, you are absolutely right. The United States announced the contribution to the United Nations is larger than China. However, because the United States has run arrears and refused to pay the full amount, right now the United States is indebted to the United Nations to the extent of about $2.8 billion US in total. China, for the last several years, has been the largest member state which actually paid the largest amount of money to the United Nations. That means China takes its membership very seriously and has never become in arrears of its membership fees and other contributions. Now, secondly, from the Chinese perspective, which is the only right perspective, the international order founded back in 1945 was not meant to be a unipolar world. It was meant to be a multipolar world. Defending multipolarity in the world order is what was meant to be the case back in 1945 and has always been the guiding principle for China's foreign policy initiatives.
Now, China also plays a key role in keeping the peace in conflict zones around the world. I mean, if we look at some of the figures, it has the largest troop presence. It is the biggest troop contributor for peacekeeping missions. China has dispatched 50,000 personnel to 30 UN-authorized peacekeeping missions around the world. Why is that such an important function for China?
Well, I think for many decades, China considers defending peace as one of the most important foreign policy initiatives, and China wants to make sure that peace anywhere in the world should be maintained and preserved. Because from our perspective, without peace and without stability at home, you really cannot dedicate yourself to economic development and improving the living standards of the people, etc. So peace, stability, development are very much intricately involved, intertwined together. China contributes a lot to peacekeeping missions of the United Nations, sends large amount of troops, and in China, having worked as a peacekeeper within the United Nations system under the UN banner, is really a high badge of honor for the participating soldiers and officers. And this has become a tradition. From the Chinese perspective, spending money, spending resources, and helping other people in other parts of the world, especially in war-torn regions, to preserve peace is truly a badge of honor.
Victor, as I said, the United Nations is commemorating 80 years of its founding, and the Secretary General right now, Antonio Guterres, he's announced an initiative to reform the organization. What is your view on reforms? Can the United Nations be reformed to the point where it gives more voice, a better voice, to the developing world?
Well, when we talk about the reform of the United Nations, it actually has many dimensions to it. First of all, the headquarters of the United Nations has been in New York ever since 1945. But the US government has not only been running arrear in its membership fees, but also has failed in providing the maximum convenience to the participating delegates from all the member states. Sometimes it refuses to issue visas, etc., making jobs very, very difficult for the member states. So the first thing is how to convince member states, especially major member states, to pay their membership dues and to make sure that the United Nations will have enough financial wherewithal to run its businesses and operations. That's number one. The other thing is that the world is changing very fast, and the United Nations, other things being equal, need to be adapted very quickly and efficiently to the new demands and the new challenges, which keep surfacing on a daily, monthly, or annual basis. Now, all these are easier said than done, but the key component of that is how to line up enough financial resources, how to make sure that all member states pay the membership dues, and how the waste can be cut down, and how efficiency can be improved, and how the multilateral system, the multipolar system headed by the United Nations for the whole world can be preserved for better peace, greater peace, and less war and elimination of war.
Victor Gao, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
To continue our conversation on the future of the United Nations, we welcome two ambassadors from Santiago. Jorge Heine is the former Chilean ambassador to China and author of the book the non-aligned world. And from Cape Town in South Africa, we're joined by Ebrahim Rasool. He is the former South African ambassador to the United States. Welcome to both of you. Ambassador Jorge Heine, let me start with you. The United Nations, as I said, is celebrating its 80th anniversary of its founding. There have been lots of challenges for the organization over the decades. How would you assess its accomplishments, its challenges, and its contribution to keeping world peace?
Well, I would say the following. It has been said that if the United Nations did not exist, it would have to be invented. And I think that is a good assessment of this very significant role that the UN has played. The UN, established, of course, in the aftermath of World War II, has been the primordial multilateral organization. Today, it provides services and helps 130 million displaced people around the world. It deals with the situation of 120 million people that need food. It provides vaccines to about half of the world's children. It thus plays an absolutely critical role on the humanitarian front, on the peace and security front, and in the development front. It has 37,000 employees. There are about 90,000 UN peacekeeping forces. And given the world's interconnectedness and this globalized world in which we live in, you need an entity that provides some global public goods, that sets some rules, and that tries to, well, keep the world moving in the right direction. So I think the UN is an absolutely essential entity in today's world. I must say I am very disturbed by the crisis it is undergoing right now and the severe budgetary cuts it is facing, personnel cuts. I think we need to reckon that we need the United Nations. The world needs the United Nations, and we must do whatever is needed to keep it going.
Ambassador Ebrahim Rasool, good to have you with us. The United Nations over the years has come under its fair share of criticisms. That is something that the organization recognizes. In fact, the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, has unveiled a plan to modernize the organization, to reform it. It's called UN 80, the UN 80 initiative. It focuses on three main areas: identifying efficiencies and improvements, reviewing the implementation of mandates from member states, and conducting a strategic review of more profound, more structural changes and program realignment. What do you make of where it goes to from here?
Let me first, Anand, concur with what Jorge says, that the United Nations is an indispensable force for good and it should be retained. However, the retention and the importance of the United Nations is not the be-all and end-all, and I think that the United Nations is indeed facing the need for a UN 80 reform program. I think that we cannot be too over-obsessed with its managing the budgetary and financial crisis at the expense of the enormous moral crisis that the world is also facing. And so I think Africa particularly cannot wait any longer before it is represented on important bodies like the United Nations Security Council. It cannot wait and watch how vetoes are used to allow impunity, particularly of genocides and so forth. And I think certainly this is a moment when I think we must have an all-of-the-above strategy, one that allows the financial and programmatic survival of the United Nations, but one that also strategically orients the United Nations to respond to the world that we are finding ourselves in.
Ambassador Heine, what is your view on expansion of the United Nations in terms of how developing nations are represented, especially on that important forum that Ambassador Rasool just spoke about, the Security Council? I mean, is it time for a country from Africa, or from Latin America for that matter, to be on the Security Council with the power for veto?
Yes. The key question there is, how is it possible that in 2025 we have in the P5, that is the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council with veto power, 2 Western European nations, the United Kingdom and France. Yet there isn't a single country from Africa or from Latin America in that category, in that group. This, of course, reflects the realities of geopolitics in 1945, but it certainly doesn't reflect those of 2025. And I would argue that the crisis of the UN today, such as it is, reflects a broader crisis of multilateralism. That is, the notion that countries should work together, should coordinate each other, should cooperate with each other to look for solutions for global problems. In that sense, it seems to me that it's absolutely essential to enhance the legitimacy of these bodies. Part of the crisis of the UN has to do with the fact that it is not seen as legitimate by many countries around the world because it doesn't really represent the countries of the global South. And that is also true, of course, for the Bretton Woods institutions. So we're dealing here with a much deeper problem of international institutions that do not represent the realities of today's world. One of the signal features of today's world is the rise of the global South. And countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America need to be properly represented in these bodies to make them work and have them move forward.
Ambassador Rasool, the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres, he said this recently, and I'm quoting him directly. He said, budgets at the United Nations are not just numbers on a balance sheet. They are a matter of life and death for millions around the world. Very profound and important statement there from the Secretary General. But at the same time, we see countries like the United States, which is cutting ties with the organization. It's also reassessing its ties with the organization. And the UN also points out that many of its members are in arrears when it comes to dues. They're not paid on time. How does this impact the UN and its functions?
No, I think certainly there is a problem of lethargy amongst those who can afford to pay for their dues in the United Nations. And I think that, as Jorge Heine says, that there is a problem of legitimacy by those who are excluded from the decision-making table. I think that if the United Nations were truly to reflect the world as it is today, then I think one could have a case for a far more enthusiastic participation in the operations and so forth. But the United Nations has to overcome the episodes of misuse of the United Nations, such as, for example, the war on terror and the 30 years of conflict and so forth, where unilateralism was the instrument and the United Nations the fig leaf. And so I think it has to manage multiple balls that it is juggling as it goes forward. And most importantly, I think that the United Nations, as Jorge again says, reflects the reality of 1945, in which nations had to be managed and therefore an international system was in place. Now, for example, conflicts are global, pandemics are global, hunger is global, migration is global, and so what you need is not international governance, you need global governance, governance that can make decisions for entire regions rather than country by country. And I think that that would, for example, create a greater stake in the United Nations for many, many other nations that are there.
Ambassador Heine, as Ambassador Rasool points out, conflicts are global, and we're seeing many conflicts around the world right now. We see conflicts in Africa, in Ukraine, and then we look at what's going on in Gaza, which the United Nations has called plausibly a genocide. We see the political divisions around the world right now. I mean, how important is it for the UN to meet these challenges and to end conflict?
Yes, well, it is absolutely critical. And what has happened, of course, is that we had a certain period after the end of the Cold War, from 1991 onwards, in which there was a spirit of international cooperation that really helped, the creation of a number of new international institutions, the International Criminal Court, the WTO, and that really gave a push to international cooperation and coordination, which was, what the world needed. Yet today, unfortunately, we have moved towards a situation in which that international cooperation has been replaced by basically quite naked great power competition. And that, of course, has meant that the notion that nations should work together, hand in hand, has been essentially abandoned. The utmost example of that, of course, was the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020-21. One would have thought that would have been the best moment for nations to work together. And that it didn't happen. And the result were there for all to see, with many millions of deaths and fatalities. So what I would like to underscore, it is absolutely essential to recover that notion of coordination and cooperation. And what I would like to see is within the Global South, within countries in Latin America, Africa, and Asia, working together to push in that direction, rather than us being absorbed in this competition among the great powers that is having such detrimental effect on humanity.
Ambassador Rasool, the United Nations is made up of many agencies. One of the most important is its legal arm, is that part of the United Nations which seeks to hold people who violate human rights, who commit war crimes, hold them accountable. South Africa has been closely involved in that. It's taken Israel to the International Court of Justice. So put that in perspective for us in terms of the broader mandate of the UN to hold people accountable.
No, I think that it's absolutely critical that there ought to be a kind of global policing system that decides what is right and what is wrong. And the United Nations is best placed to do that. It cannot be left to a single power to determine where a coup is right and where a coup is wrong, what is a genocide, what is not a genocide. And so certainly the United Nations is the most impartial body for us to be having. However, it is then undermined by the idea that some countries have a veto, and that those countries actually exercise their veto when it is needed. And then on top of that, you have a superpower being able to determine whether a United Nations rapporteur is persona grata or persona non grata. I think that what we are seeing is the systematic emasculation of the United Nations when a particular country or set of countries feel that the United Nations is not playing their way any longer.
Okay, and that is where we have to leave it. Thanks to both of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington.